Welcome to this episode of Selling on Giants. Today we're diving into a critical issue faced by many Amazon vendors, preventing shortages and chargebacks. Our guest, Khoo, Director of Sales at Khoo Commerce, an Amazon vendor software solution designed to help businesses streamline operations and reduce costly errors when handling purchase orders. With over $1 billion in orders managed, Chris has built a platform that empowers businesses to operate more efficiently, save time, and prevent thousands of dollars in chargebacks each month. In this episode, we'll explore the root causes of shortages and chargebacks, and more importantly, how to prevent them. If you're an Amazon vendor looking to reduce costs and improve your efficiency, you won't want to miss this expert insight from one of the leading authorities in the vendor central space. Let's dive into the main takeaways from my conversation with Chris. In this episode, we tackle one of the most pressing challenges for Amazon vendors, shortages and chargeback. Chris shares valuable insights on how to prevent these costly issues, streamline operations, and reduce errors. Here are a few key takeaways from our conversation. Understanding shortages and chargebacks. Chris breaks down the root cause of these issues, explaining what they are and how they directly affect your business's profitability. Next, we chatted about the importance of prevention. Rather than focusing on reclaiming funds, Chris emphasizes the importance of addressing the root cause early to prevent shortages and chargebacks from occurring in the first place. Next, we talked about self-audits and tracking metrics, learning how to conduct a self-audit, where to check for these issues in Vendor Central, and the key metrics vendors should be monitoring to stay ahead of the curve. Lastly, we talked about staying compliant with Amazon updates. Chris also shared his insights on how recent changes in Amazon's pallet and labeling requirements impact vendors and what actions are necessary to avoid penalties. Let's jump into the full interview with Chris and explore how you can apply these strategies to your own Amazon Vendor Central operations. Hey, Chris, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here. We are thrilled to have you to talk about Vendor Central and some of the key topics or key things that vendors can do to learn and take advantage of to help improve their profitability. But to start it off, could you share a little bit about your background and how you got into e-commerce, specifically working with Amazon vendors?
Sure thing. It's great to be on here, Will. It's great to be chatting with you again. My journey into e-commerce actually started when I was much younger. I was 11 or 12 when I was selling dropship products just through a website. But it wasn't until much later I'd gone to University of Cambridge, graduated, got myself into sales, and it's actually my father's business who was running a whole e-commerce operation. And we had customers that were Amazon vendors, and I gave up my sales job. I was working for a big pharma company, came and joined back in 2019. And I said, I believe that this is the future. I think we've got a real opportunity here to help Amazon vendor businesses grow. And sure enough, it was shortly after that, the COVID lockdown hit. The rates of volume of sales going through Amazon really went up quite a lot. And we knew we were onto something. We were just taking on more business and taking on more clients each month. We found we hit a real niche and a real pain point that we were able to solve. That order management journey was just really slow. And we just gave something which just saved them 5, 10, 15 hours a week. So it just kind of evolved quite organically. And since then, we've got much more disciplined, grown much faster, expanded across the world. And it's just such a great space to be in. I love it.
That's amazing. And running an agency and working with vendors on Vendor Central, I will say chargebacks can be painful, the shortages and everything that comes with that. It's like you're already selling wholesale, and if not properly operating, it's just going to cost you even more money, and then profitability can be really difficult. In terms of your journey, so it was your father's company, you saw the opportunity. Timing is everything with entrepreneurship, so it sounds like you timed it really right. What has been like your biggest challenge as a business owner, as you've been kind of in the space and learning about vendors and learning how to help them?
The learning side was great. I like getting in and understanding all the technical details. When I first joined, I actually read all of Amazon's manuals. I did all of their training. From that, I actually then went back to the product team and said, hey, we need to change some stuff. We need to fix it up and make it much better. But I actually think the biggest challenge is when we go to companies, when we talk with them, trying to help them understand what Amazon requires and what they need to do on the ground, and help to convince the higher management often of what needs to happen, the process change that needs to occur. There's just often a lot of friction there, because even sometimes you have people on the ground that know something needs to change, or people that are getting in finance, they can see issues coming back from Amazon and they understand the issues. But having the whole business aligned, it's very important that the company that you're dealing with is not just seeing it as, well, we sell $1 million, we take $50,000 or $100,000 in fines, where overall we're still profitable. It's trying to actually create that narrative of, well, how can we make it better? And certain companies have a growth mindset, and others just have a conservative mindset. And often the challenge is trying to help empower the individual people on the ground to achieve those, growth goals successfully. I think that's a constant struggle we come up against.
That's beautifully said too. And finding the decision makers is its own challenge, but like educating throughout the way is a big part of any type of service industry. So I can totally see how that's a challenge, and probably still a challenge to this day. So thanks for sharing that. That was really insightful. On that note, let's jump into the main topic. I am pumped to talk about how vendors can prevent shortages and chargebacks. So Chris, before we get too deep into this topic, and for some of our new vendors who might be listening in, can you start by explaining what shortages and chargebacks are, and how they can impact your Amazon vendor account?
Absolutely. Shortages and chargebacks are the two major classifications of deductions that Amazon will apply to your invoices before they pay you. Chargebacks are usually related to compliance issues. For example, you delivered the product late, you delivered it and the item needed some sort of prep requirement, bagging or sealing or something like that. Maybe you didn't tell Amazon all the correct information and they had to do some sort of extra work to put all that information together. And chargebacks usually are a per item fee, maybe 12 cents or 20 cents for the kind of rework charges, or a percentage-based fee. If you've canceled an item too late, they sometimes charge 3%, 9%, depending on the exact specifics. Shortages, on the other hand, are more to do with when you claim you've shipped them 100 units, but for whatever reason, they say only, let's say 90 of them arrived, and they're only going to pay you for what they think actually arrived. It gets very thorny because once it leaves your facility, it's in the truck, goes to Amazon, they receive it. You don't have visibility. No one here has cameras inside Amazon's receiving center checking, oh, I can see, look, there's 100 units there. And most of the time you did ship exactly 100 units. But those discrepancies lead to them having a claim against you. That will go back and forth for a long time between you and them. Often there'll be some kind of settlement that happens around that, whether you do that individually on a case-by-case basis or you settle across a number of different cases. But overall, these two issues can contribute to quite a big margin eroding process for an account. It's quite typical that charges could be maybe 1 to maybe 5%, and shortages could be also anything from 1 to 10% of the revenue of goods shipped in, which together, if left unchecked, could really just completely eat all your margin on your Amazon business. So we're focused on trying to help get to the root cause of all the issues, prevent them wherever possible, and then trying to help put scalable solutions in place for companies to continue to operate profitably.
Beautiful. So, and that's really well said. And I mean, dude, 9 to 10% of your margins due to some of these errors, whether they're on you or Amazon, that's a significant amount of money to take off your profits, essentially. Based on that, so what are some let's dive into chargebacks before we talk about shortages. What are some of the common root causes of chargebacks? I know you mentioned a few of them, but like what specific actions could sellers take to prevent them? And what are some things that you've seen like that you were able to systemize to kind of prevent this happening again for some of these vendors?
Yeah, so the first step when looking at it is just to get all the data in. I know that's a very cliche thing to say, bad data in, bad data out, but you can go to Vendor Central, you can get your chargeback data very easily for the last 12 months, put it into a big spreadsheet, do a pivot table. You can break it down by ASIN, you can break it down by subtype, everything. The most common ones that we see, and it won't be a mystery to any of the listeners I know, is PO on time accuracy, cast information compliance, PREP, which has several subtypes, and then ASN accuracy. They're the most common ones that we see. In terms of what you can do, we would recommend, like I say, a thorough analysis, particularly on the PREP side of things. You want to look at your supply chain to see where the PREP could or should be happening. Some brands choose not to do any PREP because it's actually more cost efficient for them to take the PREP charge with Amazon
Wow.
You just need to make sure you're building that into your margin calculation. That's all I'd say about that. But for ones like cost and information compliance, there's something going wrong with the labeling. Things like ASN accuracy, there's something going wrong with the information going in the ASN. Most likely it's the expiry date or it's the carrier tracking reference number not being put in correctly. Some of these things are even beyond your control, right? It's the carrier that's doing that, or it's the person booking in through Carrier Central. But these little education pieces, they might be going under the surface, but it could still be costing $10,000, $20,000 every year. Wow. And it's very possible just from having a conversation about it. So we can go into the specific subtypes in more detail if you like, but when it comes to charges, it's very data-driven, big spreadsheet, have a look at it, have the conversation. You might even determine that some specific ASINs are not actually profitable to be supplying in the way that you're currently supplying them once you factor in all the different charges. And it's very easy to get a bit too head-driven on, well, here's what it costs us to buy, and here's what we're selling it for. We're making money, but you need to build in all the hidden costs too.
Mm-hmm. That's well said too. There are lots of hidden costs, whether you're a vendor or seller on Amazon. And I'm always surprised when I meet with brands like how they have like a roundabout our profitability. They're not always like, yeah, we make 5% on every product, for example. It's always like, we think we're around this. And it's like, wow. Not knowing that seems like it can be crippling, especially if you think you're making money and you're actually losing money. And we've had cases where when we did a fee analysis, we found out they're losing $1 or $2 every order, and that completely changes their perspective on that product. When you're working with these vendors and you're doing chargebacks, like primarily who are you working with? Like who, not that we're doing the blame game, but generally who's the culprit? Is it their 3PL? Is it their in-house? Like generally, based on your experience, like what are some of the typical things that they're getting wrong? Is it always the labels? Are they crushing boxes before they put them in and sending them out?
It does depend on the particular business. Some have a 3PL, some have in-house. Sometimes it's the warehouse that manages the process. Sometimes it's in the admin team. Sometimes it's even in the finance team. It depends on the specific subtype. But most of the time, like you say, we're not trying to get into a blame game. And it's never nice to go into a company and say, well, in a way, people want to be told what they're doing wrong, but they also don't want to be told that, this person in this department is costing them $50,000 a year. That's not a nice way to approach it. We like to think of it more as an educational process where you say, here's the standard and here's where we're falling short. When we looked at your whole process, we can see that, for example, in the warehouse, box labels are not being applied correctly. When they go to make the ASN expiry dates for these perishable products are not being added in. When they're bagging up the products, there's a whole subset of these liquids that are not being bagged correctly. This kind of thing. When they're processing the purchase orders, they're being cancelled, but they're being cancelled too late. And because of that, you're getting charged 3%. And over the last year, all of these issues, so on, cost you, let's say, $200,000. And when you then go to, and you can do that presentation, we did that very recently, actually, for a business we're pitching to. It becomes very easy to demonstrate, well, here's a solution that we have. We estimate conservatively we could save you some fraction of that, depending on the specific breakdown of what the charges are. And then they can just say, well, great, get to work. We just want to make more money. And these charges can become quite big. If you've got a vendor account doing 10 million a year, it really wouldn't surprise me if their charges are 200,000-300,000 a year. That would be very and I'm not saying that's acceptable, but it just really wouldn't surprise me. And then it's very easy to then go in and say, well, let's look at this process and where we can make it better.
Yeah, that's well said too. And especially some of the bigger brands, I could definitely see how it just goes under the radar. The fees are incremental, so until you put it all together, you don't really notice how much you're bleeding. On that note, this was some really good information on chargebacks, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it a little more in depth, but I do want to jump over to shortages. So how do shortages typically occur, and what processes should a vendor implement to catch these issues before they actually impact the supply chain? And what I really want to know, what do you do when the problem's on Amazon?
Yeah, so shortages are a thorny problem because there's several stages to it. There's you packing the goods, there's you putting the boxes on the labels on the boxes, putting it into the courier takes it to Amazon, they unbox it, and then they put it through their tunnel. And most small parcel shipments go through the PID tunnel, the product identifier tunnel, PID, and then they get scanned, trying to see what barcodes are on it. And there are actually 8 main root causes of shortages. We wrote a blog on it. I can link to it somewhere, I'm sure, after this. But it can cover things like theft, loss, incorrect labeling, because something goes wrong on Amazon's side. But the most common cause is when it is actually something going wrong on the Amazon receive process. So their ideal is they take the box in, put it on a conveyor belt. They got 6 cameras on all sides, scan, find all the barcodes, receive it. They know what it is. Great. If that goes wrong for whatever reason, it has to go over to a problem solver. And they have to open up the box, and they've got to try and figure out what product it is, who it came from, what order it is on, what ASN it's on, how many units. And they're really great at determining which product it is. That it's going to be pretty obvious because it will have the ASIN probably printed on the product itself. But the tricky thing is they might match it to the wrong purchase order that it was due on, or they might even match it to the wrong supplier. So vendors will often see this. You could have 2 open purchase orders, each for 100 units, and one of them goes to 110 and the other one goes to 90, something like this. One gets a short, so they don't pay that invoice, and then the other one gets an overage, and then of course they're not going to necessarily pay you for the extra 10 because you only invoiced them on that one for the 100. And it might even out in time, those 10 get reassigned back to the other 90 and so on. But the items might eventually get mismatched. Sometimes they even have to count the physical units in the box. They have to take them out and say, okay, I've got 24 there or so on. And it's very strange if you're shipping pure case packs. If you've got defects just of 1 or 2 units, the whole case didn't go missing, right? 5 cases of 20, they only received 98. Well, clearly they got 5 boxes, but how did they only get 98? Well, it's because they had to open them up and count them, and maybe they just misscanned 2 out of the 100 units, that kind of thing. But as a vendor, the only thing you can really do about that is to ensure that it doesn't go to the human process. So you want to make sure you put the right, we call it the license plate label on the carton, so that when it goes through the tunnel, it gets received very smoothly. That's my big headline takeaway that I would give to people. Nice. You want to make that as smooth as possible for them.
Beautiful. And yeah, I mean, that's really interesting too, because we've seen that on the back end where, I mean, you hit on the head 98 and it's 100 and you're like, dude, they come in packs of 100. There's no way you're able to claim 98. And it's really interesting that it sounds like a lot of the errors that happen inside of Amazon is like when the human comes in. So the machine didn't work, and then it's a person, John, who I'm sure is under a tremendous amount of pressure because we've all seen what it's like working in some of those fulfillment centers. They got to count 100 units in 3 seconds, and of course they're miscounting. And then you as the vendor, not sending enough, so you're being dinged there, and then having an overage here, which would all equate to chargebacks, right? If you have an overage, they're going to say, hey, you shipped too much, and they're going to hit you with another fee, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of sympathy for the people on the Amazon receive process who have to sort through, and there's a whole jumble of stuff. I mean, one of the places I actually encourage people to look is you won't necessarily see that something went wrong on the PID tunnel. You won't necessarily see that. But if you go over to the Chargebacks tab and you look for the cost information compliance defects, they actually give you the scanned images of the box as it got received. Not always. They give you, and you can see the pictures. All 6 sides, you can see them going through. And either you can see that your box label got crumpled, it got covered up, or it was missing altogether. And you can go, oh, I can see why that box went wrong. And now they'll give you the chargeback for the label being incorrect. It's 12 cents or 15 cents. But that's not really where the cost is. The cost is they then had to open that box up and find the items individually. And each of your units could be worth however many dollars. So it's 12 cents is going to become, irrelevant in that scheme of things. So that's where one place I encourage people to look is to be familiar and to actually understand. Amazon, if they had their way, they would just put everything through the tube and it would get scanned perfectly.
In a perfect world.
And they can't do that. So they have to sort through a big jumble of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. You wanna smoothly get that scanned in as best as possible.
And I'm sure overall, as much as we complain about Amazon and they're able to keep you in business for these inefficiencies, they billions of products funnel through their fulfillment centers. So if you look at percentage wise, it's probably a really small percentage that actually get flagged and need to go through this process. So that's totally understandable. For some of our vendors that are listening that it's resonating with, or they're having a hard time understanding what their chargebacks are, or if they're getting hit with shortage, how would they do a self audit? How would you recommend getting started to start analyzing to figure out where are these discrepancies and how can I identify them?
Yeah, so it's at several stages. One, if they want to do it completely themselves, you can go to the operational performance dashboard. You can see your own charges. You can export all that information out for many years. The shortages is a bit more complicated to do the analysis on, but the most basic way is to pull out your remittance information, break it down by invoice. You have to do some work in Excel. You can then reconcile which invoices were paid, how much was left over, what the deductions were, and so on. And then you can pull that together. You'll need to take a reasonable period of time for that to be significant, just because of the way the payment reconciliation process works. It's actually something that we provide as a service, as like an initial first step for companies. Not to get too ahead of myself, but if companies are struggling with this, it's our first step is we say, hey, let us come in and do an audit, and we'll just tell you the lay of the land. We don't charge anything for that. That's our promo, our gift to Belovix listeners, is to help to do that initial audit for them. And we can compile that information and come back to them and say, well, your revenue was $8 million. Your charges were 250,000. Here's the breakdown, and so on.
Damn. Well, for anybody listening, Khoo Commerce is inside the show notes, so be sure to check those out below. Follow up with Chris. You heard him, free audit. So let's get Chris and his team real busy, so you guys can get some of those back. And to his point too, accounting is like it's like my kryptonite. So having to analyze all these accounting forms and stuff would make me go cross-eyed. So I'd much rather leverage a service than do it myself. That's for sure. But jumping back in, so we're talking a bit about shortage, chargeback. Are there any baseline metrics that you use that, like, we're all about KPIs and metrics. So outside of the chargebacks, is there any other indicators that might be on the platform that you guys use to help inform yourself for establishing either baseline data or anything you would track regularly as a vendor?
I mean, they did recently revamp a lot of their reports. They added a whole set of new metrics and graphs to Vendor Central, which is quite interesting to look at. Things like PO on-time acceptance and PO acceptance rate. That can be some of the metrics that people like to track. I know that on the marketing side, people like to track net PPM and all the different other TACOS and ROAS and all the other different metrics they like to track. Maybe I'm just much more operational, but I like to look at the sell in rather than just the sell out. But sell out is always going to be king. But yeah, we mainly look at those metrics. We mainly look at what are the charges, what are the shortages, what's the revenue, what's the process, and where could it be done better. That's mainly where we start.
Beautiful. And sounds like very operational, so not surprising there. When it comes to labeling, packaging, and pallet requirements, what are some of the most common mistakes that you find vendors making as they're getting ready to send these orders over to an Amazon fulfillment center?
There are so many ways you can go wrong with labeling. The top ones are, the biggest mistake is to not label your boxes. That sounds obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. Even if you're on the pallet vendor program, you might want to consider labeling each individual carton. I was actually chatting to a supply chain expert recently. She used to do many, many years of working in big FMCG companies. And they had the pallet program, but she said when they went to Amazon, they found that even though the pallets were going into a different pallet receive area, when that got full, they would get broken down and they would get sent to the small parcel receive area instead. And because they weren't labeling at the box level, guess what? Everything got manually received, shortage weight rate went through the roof. And there was no way of knowing, oh, how busy is a particular fulfillment center going to be on a particular day?
Yeah.
You don't know. So it was a bit like playing roulette. Now, maybe you would say the operational cost is worth it. I don't know. That's one to evaluate internally. So my number one is make sure you label your boxes. Number two is if you're dealing with perishable products, you have to be putting the expiry date in the batch or the lot information into that ASN. Very, very common that we see that go wrong. And thirdly, if you're using pen and paper to track and record all this information, it's going to be having issues. So many times we talk to companies and they have someone with a piece of paper, they're ticking it off, then they go back to a computer, they key it all in, and then they get a bunch of labels and go back to the boxes and put the labels on the box. And I say, great, you're labeling the box. But the bad news is you've got 80 cartons here, and you're having to play mix and match with, okay, I've got box 46, and it's a jar of 12 pickles, and where's my box? Oh, it's there. And you can just feel that's going to go wrong. So, what we recommend is put a system in where you can just take the product, put the label straight on the product, and it's done. Put the license plate on it. And that's really where we see a lot of the operational problems occurring.
Man, that's a really good point too. And like we mentioned with Amazon having to, like, the fail points where we get these chargebacks is like a human going in and doing something manually and just making mistakes. It's the human condition. So if you are a vendor and you're having your fulfillment center with an old-fashioned checklist. While it is costly, it could be worth the investment to level up your technology in order to alleviate some of these mistakes and also make it smoother on your team to save time. So there's lots of benefits to having a system in place. On that note, I know in the services industry, communication is key. It's super important. So in your world of logistics, like what role does communication play with logistics partners and internal teams in preventing shortages? And how can vendors improve communications to minimize some of the errors that occur?
Yeah, communication is really critical, both within the organization and also from your organization to your trading partners. So specifically, we're looking at your communication over to Amazon. Most of the time, that's going to take the form of an EDI connection, specifically in this case, the 856 ASN. That communication message, absolutely critical to make sure that's right and validates it. Obviously, we can help with that as being an EDI service provider. But then also the internal communication, I think, is very critical too. We touched on it earlier, that often one department is experiencing the pain and another part is doing the process which is causing the pain, and then another part is trying to scratch their head, figure out what's going on here. And having those discussions internally in a very non-judgmental, just how can we make this better kind of way, it does take a mindset change sometimes internally. So that's, in addition to ripping all your information out and putting in an Excel spreadsheet, my second recommendation internally would be have a discussion amongst yourselves. Get the head of supply chain, get the head of the warehouse, head of e-commerce, head of finance, maybe even get the IT person and spend half an hour saying, is there something we should be looking at? Because I've just found a $250,000 problem on our balance sheet that I think we can do something about. And then it's going to be more than that. You're not going to solve it in half an hour, but having the ability to have that conversation, absolutely critical.
Beautiful. Well said too. And you sound like I'm sure in your role sometimes you play mediator a bit. It sounds like there's lots of different people involved. And a big thing we talk about on the advertising side is like you can't sell products that aren't available. So having your operations on point and having inventory available and in stock efficiently plays a big role. My last question for you before we talk a little bit about KooCommerce and like what you guys do great. Are there any acceptable level of chargebacks or shortages? Is there anything that that you would just say is like, it's okay to have a 1-2%? This is just the nature of the beast, or working with KooCommerce and being a vendor in general, like you should strive to have zero shortages and zero chargebacks in a perfect world, of course.
That's a thorny question. I think it's a good question though. In some ways, my answer is, yep, you always aim for perfection. 0% is the goal. Get it all down and reduce it and eliminate it. If I put my pragmatic head on, I more take a view and say, and I'll give an example. We worked with one vendor. They were experiencing 300,000 a year in shortages and chargebacks. We then worked with them. We saw that number drop down to 25,000. Now, am I unhappy they're still losing 25,000 in shortages? Yes. Am I happy that we are able to save them 275 every year? Yes. Like that's a win in my book, and it was a win for them too. So in a way, it's more about saying at what level are we comfortable? And they weren't happy at 300, but they were happy at 25 for the scale of their sales volume. And it's a similar thing with charges. I've actually heard some people say all chargebacks from Amazon are always justified, but shortages, there's a bit more wiggle room on. Some people don't completely subscribe to that way of thinking. Their reasoning is that charges are because you just did something wrong. You canceled something late, didn't bag it, didn't process the order correctly. You actually are just clearly at fault. And obviously Amazon waives some of those charges. So to some extent, you'll be able to get away with some level of defect, regardless of what the financial implications are for that. I would suggest that you want everything probably to be under 1%. That would be where I would aim. 2% might be okay. But once we see people start to creep over 3% on any kind of metric, we think that there's probably some sort of structural problem that needs addressing.
Interesting. Great baseline data. So shoot for over 1% for our listeners, 2% getting in the yellow zone. If you're above 3%, give Chris and his team a call so they can do an audit for you guys and help you guys figure out what systematic issue is causing you to erode your profit margins. And we know as vendors who sell, your margins are a little thinner than they are if you are on seller or selling direct to consumer on your website. Chris, this was really great. Now I want to talk a bit about KooCommerce to kind of like what you guys do really great. So can you give us an overview of KooCommerce, specifically how you address some of these challenges with vendors as they face shortages and chargebacks?
Sure. So in a nutshell, KooCommerce is a SaaS application, web-based, helps you manage, process all of your POs, ASNs, routing, collection instructions, carrier integrations, labels, invoices, the whole journey to Amazon vendor in one place. If you use it, you don't need to go to Amazon to manage your purchase orders. You don't need to go there to make routing, to make shipments, to make labels, to send invoices. You just all manage it within our platform. And we do it fully integrated into your ERP as well. So if you use NetSuite, SAP, some other internal ERP, we have many, many connections. We also integrate all the information into that too. So we're really trying to help people that either do it manually, so they've got someone on Monday morning and Wednesday morning just smashing through lots of orders, or they're incurring large amounts of chargeback and operational defects on the shipment side. For example, on the shipment side, they could have someone, like we mentioned earlier, physical sheet of paper, ticking it all off. That process, we just get rid of that. We can put our software in. You can have a barcode scanner on some tablet at the same time, hit printer, scan the box, print the label, on it goes. And it sounds very simple, but when you're doing thousands of boxes every single week, it really, really does add up. And you need to think of it not in terms of, the label costs 2 cents to print, but more in terms of that product, that box contains $50 of product. And I've got a 3% chance that it goes completely missing when I send it to Amazon. If I use the correct labels, that chance is going to go down quite a lot, and I'm going to get paid a lot more money. And it's a much more process-driven approach that we take. We kind of come in, we say, here's the gold standard, but tell us how you work, and we want to make sure we fit into that workflow smoothly. So that's a nutshell what we do. I can go into much more detail as much as you want on any particular topic.
Well, you guys sound like, I'm all about software as a solution, and it sounds like you guys are pretty custom. Like, do you find that every vendor is different? And if you just let's role play. Let's pretend I'm a vendor. Like, what does onboarding look like? What does the first 90 days of being a KooCommerce customer look like if a vendor who's listening says, "Hey, this resonates. I want to save some money." What would it look like to work with Chris and his team?
Yeah, I mean, we understand every business is unique. We want to be working with you as an individual. We're not some giant faceless corporation where you're going to get just interacting with an AI chatbot all the time. But at the end of the day, Amazon is a machine that operates very uniformly across the world, and we understand how it works best. The question is, how do we take that requirement and implement it best on the ground for you in your particular company, whether it's with your 3PL, with your on-site premises, with a mixture of the two, with your remote team based in some other location. There's going to be some quirks that come into that equation. So to your question, in terms of what the first 90 days look like, we do all the connections to Amazon. We do all the connections to your ERP as well. And then we actually take you through that process of saying, well, here's a purchase order. Let's process it in the new method. And people very quickly see that it's much faster to process it on our system. And we don't go 0 to 100 in one day. We tend to do a bit of a staged approach, where we say, let's take all the orders going to one location, or let's just take this one order and check everything works. We want to check the label printers work, check that people are happy, maybe train up 1 or 2 people in their warehouse team, that kind of thing. And then we do that maybe for about 2 or 3 weeks. And once people have got their hands around it, they suddenly realize that they don't want to do it the old way anymore. They don't want to be doing it. They feel comfortable to begin with, saying, we're familiar with the old way of doing it. The new way, let's try that. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, they say, we never want to do the old way again. We don't know how we did it for 3 years. Why do we not do this sooner? That's usually the conversation I have about week 5 or 6 of the implementation. And then we just kind of, obviously we've got support, and we'll continue to talk to people. They get new staff, they open a new facility, they expand a new marketplace, this kind of thing. But generally speaking, that's our process, taking someone on the journey.
That's beautiful. Does the vendors have a dedicated project manager? Once they're onboarded, do they interact with support and is like as needed? I'm assuming once they understand the system and they're in the flow and the sequence, it's kind of runs itself. But I'm just curious what the service portion looks like on your end.
Yeah, we welcome people to call us, email us, raise tickets, whatever it is that they feel comfortable with, depending on where they are and what particular issue it is they're facing. Most of the time, people can fix the problem themselves through our self-help guides or the video guides we've got available to help diagnose and fix some of the more common issues. Sometimes there are issues that are beyond our control. Maybe a carrier, their integration goes down, or Amazon's service itself are experiencing a little bit of a hiccup. So some things are kind of beyond our control. But yeah, we give everyone a dedicated account manager. We want to make sure that you feel listened to and heard and seen at the end of the phone. And we support both UK, US regional support. It's really a case of making sure that we understand that this is a big part of people's business. If you're doing 10 million to Amazon or 50 million to Amazon, we've got some people doing 100 million to Amazon every year. They need systems that are reliable, and they need them to be operationally on it all the time. So we put a lot of investment into that, and we'd be glad to support anyone, whatever size they are.
No, it's beautiful. Boutique, we can relate as a marketing agency. We strive to be premium quality. It sounds like you guys do too. That was really amazing. Thanks for sharing about KhooCommerce. My last question for you before I jump onto the future e-commerce, what's your case study or a client that you guys took on that you're most proud of? Like, what is some of a big accomplishment that you could share in the form of a client that you helped tremendously?
Wow, I got so many that just popped into my head all at once. Well, the headline we're going out with at the minute, we took it was a, how do we call them? They're a healthcare brand, and we chopped their shortage rate by 90%. So we can't go into the exact figures of the before and after, but their shortage rate went from 11% all the way down to 1.8%. So that was a huge reduction for them. That translates into hundreds of thousands of dollars saving for them. And we had another company, outdoor sports company, we saw a reduction of 83%, just because we were able to do the comparison before and after. That's 12 months before, wow. 12 months after. These were long-term case studies. We really wanted to make sure we weren't just seeing a blip on the graph and jumping to some fake conclusion. And they internally came to us and said, we used to have people in finance that were doing this as a full-time job. Now they just have to go in and look at it, once a week, just occasionally pick up the bits that fell out the end of the machine. So that for us is a real win. And when people come back and say, we're loving it, we don't know how we did it before, that's just so relatable to people. So big shortage claim rate, we can come in there. We're not going to get it to zero. I'm not one of those people that likes to promise the world and sell you, you'll never have any problems again. No, I'm not that kind of person. But we like to take a very process-driven approach and do the best we can, and hopefully save companies a lot of money.
Sounds like you guys integrate pretty well with the team, and that's some fantastic savings. So that's amazing. Well, we have a tradition on this show as we wrap up. We like to talk about the future of e-commerce and get your perspective on some of the latest digital trends, and specifically how they're going to affect vendors in chargebacks and shortages. So if you could pull out your crystal ball, Chris, with your extensive experience in helping vendors optimize with operations, where do you see the biggest changes coming for e-commerce, especially in how businesses manage logistics and supply chains to prevent shortages and chargebacks?
Sure. Well, you might have heard that Amazon has recently launched their new pallet label requirements. They actually launched them back in June and July this year of 24. And what they're asking people to do is assign specific boxes to specific pallets. Now, that you could do this before, it was optional, but now it's become mandatory. So what Amazon is clearly leaning towards is they want to be able to receive goods at a much faster scale, at a bigger, bigger approach. But it's going to be more work for the vendors on the ground. So we're going to see an increase in the technology requirement and the warehouse requirement on the vendor. The burden's going to go up. Amazon is trying to decrease the burden on their side. They're trying to make that smoother. And the overall aim is to inbound goods faster. And Amazon's mantra, happy customer, everyone wins. That they're always trying to be relentlessly customer-centric. On the logistics side, I do think we're going to see a rise of the 2D barcode. It's not really such a big thing yet on the vendor side. FBA labels obviously have been 2D for a while, or you can do them as well. But mostly on the vendor side, there's only kind of quite limited support for the 2D labels. So I think that could be if I was looking 3 to 5 years out, I think that's one of the things I would see on the rise. And we see little hints of that all over the place. Just the other day, they asked for RFID enabled seals when they're going on the back of trucks. So just a small change. You used to be able to have just a crimped one and you would write the seal number down. Now they want it to be an RFID tag. I wouldn't be surprised if they end up putting RFID tags on pallets next. Probably putting them on cartons, depends how cheap you can get your tags. But it's these kind of moves that I can feel that Amazon is trying to make that as smooth as possible on their side. But what that's going to mean is that vendors have to be more technologically enhanced on their dispatch team. because you can't just expect that you're going to do things the way they've always been done, and then Amazon's going to continue to receive your goods effectively. You're going to need to go with the times and upscale with the technology required to do that as well. So I think that will be my call outs of what I see as the change on that logistics and supply chain front.
That is amazing. There's a couple of gems in there too. And for any of our vendors listening, if you're still using pad and paper, your days are numbered. We're gonna have to level up your tech games. Chris, that was super insightful. So hey, thanks, Chris, for sharing your valuable insights and expertise with us today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Before we wrap up, could you let our listeners know where they may be able to find you? And if there's anything else you'd like to share about Khoo Commerce or any upcoming projects that you guys are working on?
Sure, you can reach us on our website. That's khoocommerce.com. We're also on LinkedIn or on Twitter, just at KhooCommerce, and we'd be grateful to hear from you. As I mentioned earlier, just a little shout out to Bellavix listeners. If you want us to come in and do an audit to look at your current shortages and chargebacks, do the analysis for you, we can do that absolutely free. And we'll come back to you with a report saying, here's the current lay of the land, here's what we think is going wrong, and here are our recommendations. And yeah, it's a kind of a no commitment. We just want to come in and look at it. If you think shortages and chargebacks are something which is affecting you, we'd be really glad to come in and have a look at it for you.
Beautiful. Thanks, Chris. Sir, all our listeners know in the show notes, we'll have all the links below. And feel free to mention to Chris that you heard us on Selling on Giants or from Bellavix, and he'll be sure to do that audit for you. Chris, thanks again for being on the show. We appreciate your time and your insights.
Great to be here, Will. Speak to you soon.
That wraps up today's conversation with Chris Khoo on how vendors can prevent shortages and chargebacks. I hope you found some valuable insights to help optimize your vendor central operations. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe whenever you're tuning in so you don't miss out on future episodes packed with actionable strategies for your e-commerce business. Until next time, stay classy, people.